Imagine going from feeling like you have the flu
This was fatigue on a different level. This was like my body was made out of lead.
to falling into a coma 3 days later.
Best case scenario, the next thing I remember is I wake up from the coma. Worst case scenario is I don't.
Even worse, all approved treatments have been exhausted, and your medical team didn't think you were going to survive.
This is the situation, and you can either get up and make the best of it, or you can, lay back and suffer.
This is Gary's story.
So when Castleman disease hit, I had no idea what it was. I thought it felt like a flu. But the thing is, with a flu, normally I would feel it hitting like midway through a day, not feel so well. I'd go home, eat a little food, rest, and then whatever I felt like in the morning, I'd go to work and work through it, and it would be gone. This was fatigue on a different level. This was like my body was made out of lead. I had the thought in my mind, this is all just a big mistake. I just need to, they'll probably give me something for it, or I'll be back home tonight.
Castleman's is a rare inflammatory disorder where basically your immune system becomes turned on for an unknown reason and then begins to attack your organs for an unknown cause. So it causes your liver, your kidneys, your bone marrow, your heart, and your lungs to be dysfunctional. And as a result of that, you feel really, really sick. Kind of like the worst flu you could ever imagine is how you start to feel. That it progresses into this multi-organ failure, which is life-threatening.
Within 3 days of feeling sick, Stacy said, you got to go to the doctor. As soon as the doctor looked at me, he said, you got to go to the emergency room. And within 3 days, I was on a ventilator on life support in a coma. My blood pressure was extremely low. All of my organs were failing, and so just to keep blood pumping to my organs, they put me on vasopressors. But it took the circulation away from my hands. So when I woke up at Penn, my fingertips were purple and getting darker, and within a day or two, they were black and they started hardening over. It was necrosis. My whole life I was a carpenter, and not even just in my work, but everything I did, my hands always understood what was going on. And so, long story short, I had to have surgery to amputate the parts that just weren't coming back. But a big part of the fight after that was learning to use my hands again. It's just changed the way I can operate with the world. Stacy and my brother and sister had to fight the hospital to get me to the next hospital, just to take me to the regional one where maybe there'd be more answers. There were more facilities. And somebody there found an article on David Feigenbaum and the work he was doing, and that he was a patient researcher.
I first learned about Castleman disease when I was a medical student, but I didn't learn about it in a textbook like most medical students. I learned about it because I became critically ill with Castleman's when I was a third-year med student here at Penn. I spent months and months in the ICU, even had my last rites read to me because my doctors were sure that I wasn't going to survive. And fortunately, I got a lot of chemotherapy, but unfortunately, I kept relapsing. And so my exposure to Castleman's was experiencing and then literally nearly dying from it 5 times.
David and Mileva had actually visited me while I was still comatose. So the first time I met them, the first time they met me, I didn't really meet them, but they knew Stacy.
I met Gary back in 2016. I received a bunch of phone calls the same afternoon from different doctors all around Penn saying, there's a patient in the ICU with Castleman disease and you should go up to see him. And I rushed up to the intensive care unit.
He visited me, he said he's going to come in. I'm nervous about that. But I'm picturing this, this old guy in a lab coat and, I don't know, I assume gray hair and glasses and all that sort of. And what walked in was David Feigenbaum in amazing shape and this young guy, and I was like, wow, I hope I have whatever he has, because if I can get there, I'll take it.
I was immediately struck by just how sick he was. All of his organs were failing. He looked so ill, and frankly, he looked so much like I looked when I was really, really sick. And the second thing that really caught my attention was his wife, Stacy. She is incredible, and she was right by his side, just being the supportive resource person that I had experienced from my loved ones, and I just knew how important it was that she was there and how fortunate Gary was to have Stacy by his side. And the third thing that I noticed was the view out of the window. So I walked in and I saw this window, and I was like, I kind of recognize this window. The nurse came into the room and said, David, I was your nurse when you were in the ICU years ago, and this was the ICU room that you were in. And so Gary was in the same room that I was in. And the reason I recognized that view out of the window is that I'd spent weeks looking out that window and dreaming of one day leaving the ICU, dreaming of a life and a family. So, of course, Gary in my story, and Gary and I are so connected because of this shared beginning with Castleman disease.
Before he left, he said, "We are going to beat this disease." And I so needed that call to arms.
Gary was started on a drug called ciltuximab. It's the only FDA-approved drug for Castleman disease, and it seemed to work early on, and we were so excited when it did appear that it was working for him. He was able to leave the ICU, leave the hospital, and spend some time at home with his family, so we were just so excited about that. But then about a month or so later, he reached out to me to tell me that he was relapsing, and of course, I couldn't help but think about my own journey where I also received ciltuximab and also was so hopeful that it was going to be the drug for me, but then just being really heartbroken when it didn't work for me.
I was in a rehab hospital for 3 weeks, learning to walk and feed myself again and all that sort of thing. And it was just 1 or 2 treatments. Once I was out of there, I had gone from my blood tests looked like they were still trending in the right direction to I was having my second flare. Best case scenario, the next thing I remember is I wake up from a coma. Worst case scenario is I don't, This is the situation, and you can either get up and make the best of it, or you can, lay back and suffer.
He started to have changes that occur in the ICU that his ICU nurses told Stacy, "This is it. I've seen these changes before. This is what happens right before someone passes." The nurse said the same thing to me. So ciltuximab is the only FDA-approved drug. So once that drug doesn't work for you, you're into this world of repurposing where there are no more drugs that are approved for your disease, and your only chance of survival is to find a drug that was made for another disease that we have to repurpose for Castleman. So a few different treatments were tried. One of them is a drug called rituximab that was developed initially for lymphoma, and then another is a drug called cyclophosphamide, and another one etoposide that are chemotherapies. These are drugs that have been around for decades that were intended to treat cancers. And in Gary's case, we wanted to try those drugs just to try something to try to get the disease under control. Really sort of at the last possible moment, the chemotherapy started to kick in, and all of a sudden the lab tests that were just crashing began to start to slow down and then eventually start to improve.
I thought I had hope after my first flare when they said, okay, there's a drug for that. It's a stronger kind of hope when I come through the second flare after the FDA-approved drug doesn't work, and they say, oh, well, we can try this. This may work for your disease. So I've been in remission for 6 years and 8 months.
We love sharing Gary's story because it's such a great example of how drug repurposing can actually save patient lives. We know that drugs that are approved to treat diseases don't work 100% of the time. In Gary's case, there was an FDA-approved drug for Castleman disease, but it didn't work for him, just like it doesn't work for lots of Castleman patients. It seems like they would be out of options, but the truth is that on the pharmacy shelves, there are thousands of drugs that have been approved for other uses, and it's possible that one of them can actually treat a disease like Gary's.
Repurposing is so important for rare diseases because 95% of rare diseases don't have a single approved therapy. And the 5% that do have approved therapies like Castleman's, our drugs don't typically work for everyone. So even the rare diseases that do have an approved drug, we're oftentimes in this repurposing space.
This is not something that can be done by one person or even one team sitting alone looking at the literature. We really need to use this opportunity to utilize AI and machine learning to go through all the data and find the missed opportunities. At Every Cure, we're trying to do this at scale for every drug, every disease, and we really want to make this data available publicly so that people who are looking for other treatment options or researchers who are looking to do more in a certain area can use this tool to get their research started and figure out where should we put our resources, where should we put our time and attention to make sure that we're having a big patient impact that otherwise wouldn't have been made.
Over the last 11 years, we've identified 12 more repurposed treatments for Castleman disease, and we will not stop until we've identified a treatment for every single patient.
So for a rare disease patient, you've been dealt this hand, and that's the situation whether you smile or not. The smile feels better. The hope feels better.